Hi, I'm Karen. We're here at Montevilla Sewing Center, and today we're going to do a 4-step buttonhole on a basic mechanical machine. Now, if your machine has a dial that looks like this with these little markings right here, that means you can do a buttonhole on your machine in 4 steps. I'm going to walk you through that. First of all, you need to make sure that you use this foot here. This is a foot that should come with your machine if you have the 4-step buttonhole. It has a little slider. This part slides. It's kind of grippy on the bottom, which will help grip the fabric as you're sewing your buttonhole. And you put your, this is a quick change foot. So we could put this on here and just put this right down like that. Now make sure that when you put this on, you have it going this way, not backwards. One way you can test is to make sure that your needle has somewhere to go and it's not going to just go right into plastic. If it's hitting some plastic, well, turn the foot around so that it has somewhere to go. All right, now, the things you're going to need for making a buttonhole, first of all, you're going to need a button, of course, and it's helpful to have a seam gauge like this. This has this little slider here so that you can measure the front and back of your buttonhole and make marks accordingly. The marking tool I would recommend is this friction pen, but you can use any pen that's meant to put temporary marks onto your fabric. I would not recommend using like a ballpoint pen that you'd use for writing on paper, because they're not meant for making temporary marks. You want something that's meant for sewing. And then you need a seam ripper. Now this is what the seam ripper looks like. Most of you are probably familiar with this, but this is good for taking out seams that you don't want there, maybe taking out basting, but it's also really good for opening the buttonhole once you have sewn it. Okay, we'll cover that back up. And then the last little tool I like to have is this large-eyed needle, and that's going to be useful in finishing your buttonhole. Okay, so to start out with, to set up your machine for buttonholes, we need to move this dial over to here. Let's go back this way. Sometimes there's a stopper right there that keeps it from going through. So just find the way that you can move the selector dial to where it says 1. And then the length, move it over to here so it looks like a buttonhole. And this is about 0.5, so it's going to be a short length. If you look at your buttonhole, you can see that these stitches are pretty close together, so that's length. The width, it's important to have it all the way on 5, the widest width that you can have. Okay, then let's put our thread right through here like that, so it's through your buttonhole foot. Now, to know, well, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and mark my buttonhole first, and then I'll show you how to know where to put this. Okay, when you're making a buttonhole, you don't want to make it on a single layer of thin fabric like this, because it'll rumple and maybe not sew very well. And even 2 layers is not quite enough. So you either want to have some interfacing in here. Interfacing is a type of fabric. You've probably seen it's kind of filmy looking, and you also find it in collars and cuffs on dress shirts. It's what gives it that stiffness. Well, it's also going to give some stability and strength to the fabric for your buttonhole. Keep in mind, a buttonhole has buttons going through it a lot, and so it's going to need to be nice and strong and sturdy at that point. So, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to just fold my fabric so that now I have 3 layers there. I have the outer 2 layers and then 1 inner layer, which also effectively keeps this raw edge from fraying, because now it's on the inside. And I have seen nice men's dress shirts with the front made this way so that it's kind of a self-fabric interfacing. Then you want to go take your iron and press that. Make sure it's nice and flat. Okay, so with our button, I'm going to, first of all, make the line where I want it to be. And if I was going to make a second buttonhole, I'd make it down here, or wherever. Usually buttonholes should be about 3 inches from buttonhole to buttonhole. You can make them a little bit less, but you don't want to make it too much more than 3 inches. Otherwise, you get some gapping going on. You don't want that. Okay, so I'm going to mark one end of the buttonhole. Then I'm going to take my button. Looks like I need to make my long mark a little bit longer, like that. And the other end of the buttonhole, I need to mark that, but a little bit past the length of the button. That's because buttons have some thickness to them, so we need to make the buttonhole longer than the actual button. So I'm going to go about down to here. Now this also brings up another point. When you're sewing buttons on a particular kind of fabric, sew a test buttonhole on the kind of fabric that you're going to use to make your project. Do that before sewing it on your project. That way, if you need to make any adjustments here, you can do so. Okay, so I've made my buttonhole about like that, beginning and end. Now, here is where we get our seam gauge, this guy right here. At this point, I'm going to adjust the seam gauge so those little points match up with those little cross marks. Okay, and then I'm going to set this aside, keeping that there. Because when I make my next buttonhole, if this is correct, I know I can make the same distance of marks for the next buttonhole. So I'm going to set that aside there. Now, I'm going to show you here, the first step is going to be on the left side of the buttonhole. And notice where 2 is. It's on the front. So that means it's going to start here, is zigzag forward, and do its little bar tack here. And on 3, when you get over to 3, it's going to go back. And when you get back to your beginning place, you go back to 4 and you do your little bar tack. Bar tack is a zigzag that goes side to side, and it just stays in one place. It doesn't go forward or back, and it's meant to strengthen the end of your buttonhole. So let's start over here on 1. Remember, we're going to start right up there, which means we're going to start right up here, which means we've got to have our buttonhole foot, the slider part, all the way forward, because it's going to be marching back this way. So have it all the way forward. Then I like to center my long longitudinal line right between the 2 walls in the buttonhole foot there. And then I'm going to put my needle down. The needle's not going to be in the center, so don't worry about that. But you see how it's touching that bar tack there? That's great. We want it to touch the bar tack. Move that up a little bit like that. There we go. You can even be a little bit past the bar tack. So it's going to start out doing a zigzag going forward. Now we're going to take it slow, so that means press gently on the pedal. Now right away, one of the things that you can see is the right-hand swing of the needle is just barely going into the long longitudinal line. In fact, it even could be a little bit to the left of it and would be just fine. Now slow way down here. So you get to the end, and I would just, this last stitch or 2, just take by hand. Take one more stitch, there we go. Okay, now I'm going to switch it to 2, do my bar tack about, 3 or 4 stitches like that. And then always needle up. Before you change your selector, always make sure your needle's up out of your fabric and complete that stitch so you don't have a loop of thread there. Now we go to 3. So remember to take it slow, because you're going to need to stop before you get to your beginning point so you don't overshoot that. So now we're going to go back. And you can see my long longitudinal line is right in the middle of those 2 rows of zigzag. Slow it way down here. I'm almost to the end. Okay, now I'm going to take that last stitch by hand, needle up, turn it to 4, which is actually the same setting as 2. They're both bar tacks. They're just in 2 different places on the buttonhole. And we take 3 or 4 stitches, needle up, and we're done with the buttonhole. Now, you can go around the buttonhole a second time if you want that extra bit of strength in your buttonhole, but you usually don't really need to. It just kind of depends on how the garment, or if it's a bag, like how it's going to be used, how strong you want your buttonhole to be. So if I was going to do a whole length of buttonholes, I would just leave the tails together and then cut them all at once at the end. But in this case, we want to check to see if the button's going to go through the buttonhole. So I'm going to take my scissors here, and I leave it connected to the machine until I cut off the beginning threads. Those beginning threads are already anchored under the stitches, but the ending threads are not. So let's get those beginning threads out of the way. Now we've got the ending threads. Cut those, pull them to the back, and which you can even take that darning needle, that large eye needle, poke that through there. And because it has such a large eye, it's easy to just thread that right through. And then you pull it to the back like that. So you can't even see it at all. I'm going to go ahead and tie this off now to show you how this works. If this was just your sample buttonhole, you wouldn't need to do this tying off part because you're going to test it out on your scrap fabric before you put it into your project. And scraps, well, you don't intend to save those. So do a nice little square knot. Square knot is right over left, left over right. That's a square knot. And we take we don't want to cut those too short, because then the knot would come undone. And you also don't want to leave them long, because that would make it so that it just looks messy. So I'm going to take my darning needle, put it right next to my knot, not through the knot, but next to it. Then I'm going to thread my tail threads back through there and pull them to the back. Now I can trim these tails. They're inside the layers. Trim them like that, and they're hidden just fine. Okay, the next thing we need to do is cut that buttonhole. So take your pin and put it just in a little bit from the bar tack. The reason for that is that when we use our seam ripper to cut the buttonhole, we don't want to accidentally cut through that bar tack, because that would be, well, it'd be messy. Let's just put it that way. Okay, so start at the end away from the pin. Poke your seam ripper through that. Make sure that you're not cutting any of those threads. You just want to cut the fabric. Now I turn it around so I'm not hitting the pin with my seam ripper. So I want to keep my seam ripper nice and sharp. And then I cut it the rest of the way. Okay, let's see if this fits. Oh, there's extra threads here, but that's okay. Yes, it does fit, and it fits a little on the snug side, which is, for me, perfect. I don't want a button that comes unbuttoned by itself. I want it to be a little on the snug side. So because of that, I've got how far apart those marks are right here, and I can put new marks down here and make another buttonhole the same length, the same way. Now, to clean up our buttonholes, we want to make sure not to leave any of these loops of thread. You see that loop of thread there? Some buttons could get actually buttoned through that loop so that when you unbutton it, it makes pulls in the fabric. So you want to get all that cleaned up. Just clean it all up really nice. This is another way you can make your home sewn garments and projects look better than what you buy at the store, because you have taken the time to make it look beautiful. Now, I have used contrast thread for teaching purposes. Normally, you would use the exact same color of thread as your fabric. And here at Montevilla, we have some excellent thread. It's called Metrocene, good all-purpose thread. And you could probably find the exact color you need for your fabric. We've got lots of colors. So that's how you do your basic 4-step buttonhole. We've got lots of other videos on our Montevilla Sewing channel. So stay tuned, and thanks for watching. See you later. Bye.